Okay, thank you very much, Karin. Um, yeah, you said at the beginning that sometimes um, you have the impression that you're here asking questions and not providing answers. But I guess one thing to defend that sort of position, which is almost what philosophers are sometimes accused of doing, of not providing answers, is to say that if you ask the right questions, you can sometimes shape the answer. So I won't actually provide any answers, but hopefully just a couple of questions to think differently about the issue of privacy um, uh, as it's generally understood. There may be some slight formatting problem with the slides, not as sexy as I would have liked them to be, because it's written for OpenOffice and it's on a Microsoft application. But such is life. So let me start then. I suppose the idea of my talk is to try and think about privacy in a different way. There's lots of ways we can do that. We can look for insight from various people. It's good for business as philosophers to provide insight, but it's often fairly abstract. There's also people out in the public field who thought leaders, gurus who consult, always trying to give us insight on how to do things differently. There's also, I suppose, the eureka moment, where through a moment of divine inspiration, we can sometimes get new ideas and new perspectives on what we're doing. In the world of innovation, we always think about thinking outside the box, but sometimes to step outside of the way we think we need to be angels and have wings to fly and look back on what we're doing, and not many of us do have those wings. So one other way to look at things differently could then be to juxtapose and contrast, confronting the sort of limits of what we think. And so that's what I'm trying to do today. I just take a little reference here. I won't read through it. You have the French at the bottom just to help you. Although even in French it may not make sense. But the idea here of Michel Foucault is really what I'm trying to do today. He in the order, the title in English, The Order of Things, he suggested that when he read a text by Bourges that quoted the Chinese encyclopedia, he was struck by how little sense the classification of animals in China made to Michel Foucault as obviously a French and in this sort of context a European thinker. So what he came up with, or was the limits of his thinking, and I'm suggesting today then to juxtapose. I don't want to say a Japanese approach to privacy, to the idea of the individual, or even to public space, but certainly to juxtapose something like that with what's been said here and what the futures of privacy, I suppose, is about. And in this sense, I want to outline firstly a theory of Japanese-ness, for lack of a better translation. It's a controversial but quite pervasive discourse about the uniqueness and therefore the difference of the Japanese identity. Just to sketch a few of the big ideas behind that, and then contrast, as I say, with notions of privacy here. Also look at civil society and spaces of privacy that they afford in Japan. When we move into notions of civil society and perhaps also the concept of surveillance society in Japan, we do come more into sort of bridge building in the sense that certain concepts we have here do translate there and vice versa. So I'll look at those two aspects at the end. I think then just to make some links here with what Helen was saying, in some ways the problem with privacy is, I think, to do with the conception of the individual we have. contextual integrity then is in some ways taking that problem up from the individual to the context, and what I'm trying to do is go across rather than up, across, as I said, to some Japanese ways of thinking. Also, in that notion of the individual, there's also a problem which I don't think has been mentioned so far, and wasn't mentioned in the introduction by Francis, about the previous futures of privacies exchanges, is the one of capitalism is also inherent here. I mean, in the what's happening here is really an exchange of information between supposedly equal contracting parties, and this is very much linked to a liberal conception of how exchange takes place. It assumes that individuals are equals, they have something approaching perfect information, and that as equals, not one is not more powerful or dominant than the other. But there's a lot to suggest that in all exchange relations in the free market, you know, whether simply buying something from a company or in this instance exchanging information, those are flawed conceptions. We don't have perfect information, so very few of us trade on the stock market because we don't have direct access to the movements in the stock market. We also don't set the rules of that exchange. The free market is sort of abstract. Those rules are changing all the time, but they're not made by me, who then engages in the exchange. So in some ways, this notion of exchange here is what some people have called a political theological legitimation. We assume people are equal and that the exchange is fair to justify the outcome, which sometimes might be unfair. Some might get more than others. Wealth may not be distributed the way we want it. So I'm just drawing attention to that fact that one of the issues around privacy is in fact this whole notion of free market exchange, which, you know, there's a long tradition of criticizing that, but it hasn't been brought into some of the literature on privacy. And I just have a little picture there of Robert Nozick, who's kind of everyone's favorite person to cite here, the libertarian American philosopher. I don't know if any of you used to listen to Talking Heads, the American rock band. Well, David Byrne looks remarkably like Robert Nozick. I don't think it is him. But anyway, Robert Nozick personifies this vision of free exchange with his notion of entitlement. So if people come together and exchange things, the outcome by definition is just. And so obviously, to point out a very simple example where that might not be the case is to think of Europeans going into Australia or the USA, sitting down with local supposed proprietors of territory, of land, exchanging it for a very small sum, and then saying, well, this is just, and no one has an entitlement to reclaim territories taken away. So just to draw attention to the fact that privacy, I think, is linked to these issues of the free market as well. Right, so the idea of privacy I want to use here just to underline how it relates to a certain Western conception of the subject. I borrow from Alan Weston, Privacy and Freedom. He distinguishes privacy as a claim, and what's important there is to determine what information should be known to others, and implicitly when that information is to be obtained and what uses it will be made of it. This claim then becomes a right when it's obviously recognized by law, and Helen earlier mentioned Brandeis and Warren. They have a very nice definition. Again, I apologize for the formatting, it's a bit low, hard to read. It wasn't like that in the original, but they have a nice definition of privacy which corresponds to what most of us possibly intuit it to be. As they said, and of course referring back to the Founding Fathers as having some vision of how things should be, to protect Americans in their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, and their sensations, the Founding Fathers conferred, as against the government, the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of rights and the right most valued by citizens. So if that's the right to be let alone, what might an invasion of that right look like? And here I think the four sort of definitions I have here correspond to what Francis said earlier. So he mentioned freedom as a problem when it comes to privacy. We can talk about personal autonomy. We have a right to decide for ourselves what is what is central to us, and what sort of in what context we can obviously let that information out, using the word context there in the very sort of flippant way that Helen was speaking about. There's also the notion of self-determination. I think that's use without consent that Francis was perhaps talking about. So the right to control the flow of information about ourselves. Thirdly, there's the consummatory claims, and perhaps that's somewhat linked to reputation that was mentioned. This is, for lack of a better word, a right to dignity. Only last night I was in a hotel room, as one is in this situation, channel surfing, and I came across a program on Nelson Mandela and his sort of history. And part of that history of Mandela is obviously the struggle against apartheid. And there were various scenes from South African TV I well remember of the famous necklacing, where traitors, opponents were often beaten up by a crowd, and eventually the famous necklace is a rubber tire put around the body and set alight. These are shocking images, but they are seen all the time. So consummatory claims are sort of an attempt to avoid voyeurism to some extent, but also in other moments when we're not quite aware of what we're doing, to have a right to not be subject to invasions of our privacy. Finally, then, just strategic intent. And perhaps this is linked to, again, Francis's point about easy attacks and questions of identity. The right to some sort of secrecy about final intentions and ends, something we keep in our pocket, as it were, in negotiations with others. So those are just some very broad themes of privacy and nothing revolutionary. What I want to suggest is that what's common to them is a mediation of the relationship between the individual and the third party, the state, the corporation, by a set of rights, because the assumption is there is an individual who is the owner of those sets of information and data. So again, this is also an issue of ownership, which again is central to capitalism. Ownership is located in an individual in most instances. And that's something that also needs to be looked at, I guess, in the long run. But the reason we have this notion of privacy is obviously about protecting the corporeal sovereignty of the individual in the early modern period. I suppose trying to protect individuals from arbitrary violence, from powers that weren't constitutionally regulated. We then move into a more noble attempt to give privacy to individuals in the sense that we take them to be the authors of all these actions, ideas, thoughts. And then today, I guess, the notion of privacy comes in relation to surveillance and technology. And again, the issue there is not so much that surveillance is simply a new form of invading privacy, but it's a different form in the sense that it actually constitutes the things it looks at. I think surveillance changes the whole conception of the individual, as well as obviously invades classic conceptions of it. But the common denominator here I'm suggesting is a notion of a Western autonomous independent subject, the person who authors things, who imagines, who has great ideas, who we can always refer to for responsibility in certain matters. To what extent is that true in a country like Japan? The conception of the individual, is it different? What, in other words, to use the famous example of Gilbert Ryle, what happens when this notion of the individual, the ghost in the machine, this person, this self-identity within the body, the ghost in the machine, what happens when that is not how we think of individuals? In the Japanese context, there's a discourse of Japaneseness, which has a long tradition, and it can also be summed up in a famous expression that's been around there for a long time, wakon yozai, which is loosely translated as Japanese spirit, Western technology. It defines the first encounter with Japan, with the West in 1868, and the sense that what is important for Japan, and it kind of corresponds to a stereotype we still have, is the fact that they'll import, bring in, assimilate, welcome technology, broadly construed forms of bureaucratic state organization, as well as industrial techniques and today various innovatory ideas, but will safeguard and protect a certain Japanese uniqueness. So it's something that's been around for a while. As I said, it initially was in relation to China as the place to import various techniques, but it's more recently in relation to the West. But it also becomes, with the transformation in the Japanese modern state set up in 1868, the transformation from 1912 into the warmongering imperial state, it corresponds there also with an attempt to rid the West and other notions of individualism infiltrating that Japanese spirit. So this notion of Japanese spirit is like a Volksgeist, as they say in German, a sort of a notion of identity unique to a certain people. And I want to just sketch a few of the key ingredients of this. It's also just worth mentioning that this notion of Japanese uniqueness obviously is from their perspective vis-a-vis the outside, but it's also a perspective most of us buy into. You know, it's the other, the distant far east, where we don't quite know how to make sense of things. You know, various authors, Durkheim amongst them, but also more recently in post-war American writing, certainly literature and philosophy and sociology, political science, they still have those ideas of something very different. We are who we are, and they are different. Not, you know, and never the twain shall meet. There's no sense that we can come together. What are some of the basic ideas of this Nihonjin? What makes the Japanese people different and produces a different account of the subject? There's a notion, certainly from religious traditions, which of course define who we think we are as well in the West, of coming to consciousness, identity through interaction with others, through fulfilling certainly social roles. Identity then in the Confucian tradition is not within the individual, and certainly it's not about the end of being autonomous, the very central Western idea of autonomy in thought and action, the notion of maturity in Immanuel Kant, the need to stand on your own 2 feet and stop being like a child, listening to a parent, or in Kant's examples, the priest or the advisor on what you should think about the government, or so on. So it's not about that. Being an individual, in fact, in the Confucian tradition is selfishness. In the Buddhist tradition, especially Zen Buddhism in Japan, in a similar fashion to the Confucian tradition, identity is extra-corporeal. It's outside the body. It's in that interaction, that space between us, whether in relation to one person or a group. But of course, the notion of Buddhism is that self continues after the body disappears. So again, any attempt to try and reclaim yourself from the outside sphere in which it circulates is a way of disturbing the natural order of things, of reincarnation and so on. So it's a little bit of hubris. We sort of get beyond ourselves and think that we're stronger than the greater forces which surround us. There's also then a notion to try and emphasize this intersubjective, non-individualized conception of identity. In the famous samurai ethic, you've possibly seen various films, and in fact, the Japanese themselves make very good films on this. The one you'll see in a minute, not you won't see, but there is a film called Harakiri, highly recommended to make the point I'm getting at here. In the samurai ethic, loyalty, discipline, and sincerity are the keys. The idea is of a very strong self, so we might think there that we're looking towards notions of an independent, autonomous self as we understand it. But no, the idea of a strong self is all in the name of loyalty to one's group or superiors, to the extent that one has to have such strong self-discipline that in the event that you are disloyal or the group requires it, you will be able to literally extinguish yourself, harakiri, commit, suicide, disembowelment. To get, if you ever want to see a film, there's a film, Harakiri, as I said, made in the 1960s, which personifies this whole samurai ethic to a T. So those are 3 aspects. What it means then is, in Japan, we can talk about a subject in which identity is not dependent on a fully developed ego, or it doesn't correspond to being an independent person or focusing on autonomy for that matter. It's linked to various concepts here. I'm not giving the references of authors because in conversations like this, the tendency is to lose you, if I haven't already, but the tendency is to lose you because you start thinking, you know, what am I doing listening to Confucian and various concepts I know nothing about? So I won't give references to authors at all, but they are available. But the notion of the subject here is Amei, which is a unique, literally to cite Doi, the author, a unique psychological inclination, so unique to Japanese people only. So if you recognize this, you need to ask yourself who you are. A unique psychological inclination to seek emotional satisfaction by prevailing upon and depending on one's superiors. It's almost like a childlike dependence, but it's about achieving autonomy and a sense of purpose in your life through the other. Combined with a very strong Japanese everyday ethic of gambaru, literally good luck, a need for dogged determination in confronting a challenge, gambate, good luck, work hard. It's something that is very, very strong there. So even in the previous point, when you are prevailing upon trying to seek the recognition of your superiors and perhaps they're not responding, or of course there's always a possibility of abuse in that relation of an inferior to a superior, even in the face of problems, domination, misrecognition, silence, you still, with the gambaru attitude, can persist and keep going in the face of adversity. So the consequence of that is, I would suggest, an irrelevance of the concept of the individual in Japanese ontology, in Japanese modes of thinking about who we are. It is the interpersonal relationship, what in Japanese is called the kanjin, not the individuals that make the relationship, which is crucial. The self does exist. We mustn't fall into the trap of thinking Japanese people are clones, easily misled by groupthink or sheep behavior, as Francis said earlier. We mustn't think that is absent, but it simply is not located within what we call the self, le soi, the individual. It's an extracorporeal space, what's called Heidegger, and which a French polymath philosopher, thinker, Augustin Berg, has called milieu. I'm not sure if there should be another L in milieu, but anyway. So clearly the idea of the subject there is not as we understand it. Secondly, in terms of our interpersonal relationship, interaction is aligned with the group, not about creating self or individuality. In the Western tradition, broadly speaking, we talk about processes of recognition, dialogical identity, we engage with our community and come out as an independent, autonomous self. Well, that doesn't seem to work in Japan. One is subordinate within the group, and one's position within the group is a function of how long you have been within it. Harmony is the key criteria here for the group. And also within the group, what's key is to cultivate relations along a hierarchical chain rather than a horizontal chain. So, what this does then, I think, is raise a couple of questions, and this is the questions. Okay. If the subject's sense of self is non-corporal, yet mediated by the interaction of two bodies, we might readily call it a virtual self, a non-physical self, but in a reality, in that space between people. And privacy then, when it's about invasions of privacy as the ownership, doesn't seem to make sense. Why, after all, would anyone claim ownership of ideas, feelings, emotions, thoughts, preferences, personal information, which is what is, I think, the idea behind Western notions of privacy, if those aspects are only intersubjectively constituted in face-to-face interactions and located in the language as well. So I need to jump ahead then. So I'll just say a few things about civil society. In Japan, publicness has always been the key variable. There is a notion of a private sphere where invasions should not take place, but it's a fairly recent introduction, but it's always been a sort of a derivative, a spin-off of the public sphere, and the public sphere has always been very heavily linked to centralized power, whether feudal regimes or the modern state today. So again, privateness is really a secondary characteristic, a secondary area of importance. It's not what we've understood it to be in terms of keeping ourselves protected from a state which potentially might invade our bodily integrity or our sovereignty. Also within Japanese civil society, so I'm skipping a bit here, what's important, and again this is hard to think sometimes, but Japan is a radically centralized and decentralized country. There are very few CCTV cameras operated by the National Police Authority. If they exist, they're operated by local associations, homeowner associations, to which most Japanese people belong. So in other words, surveillance is not taken up and used for the purposes of state accrual of information or data, or corporate for that matter. It's very much local. I mean literally within the street block in which you live. So there's a very decentralized civil society. It's almost, the issue of privacy is not there, because there's no conception of that being anyone's business but the people who live within the very small community. So just to give you some anecdotal evidence here, in every second or third house in Japan has a little plaque on it, which has a thing that says if children ever feel threatened, they can knock on that door and go in and seek sort of refuge and be reassured, and the parents can be called. So that's one of what they mean by home ownership associations. Sorry, home ownership, national or associations that are very local in the community. Sorry. The idea is simply that it's only specific, to use the word context. The surveillance takes place within the block, within the suburb in which you live, and that information is passed nowhere else. And the issue, therefore, of privacy doesn't quite arise in the same way as we understand it. Also, just the notion of citizenship is very different as well, very, to emphasize this word, decentralized, because if things are radically decentralized, then the sense of having a surveillance society where everyone is subject to the same sort of surveillance doesn't quite make the same sense. So notions of citizenship in Japan are very much about livelihood, everyday activities, local festivals, as well as issues around work. But again, they're very context specific to the suburb you live in. I know literally where I live, the couple of associations we belong to, and there's no issue of information being passed outside of that space. If there are surveillance cameras, they are used only for that space, as I say. And in fact, in a lot of Japanese cities, Tokyo in particular, surveillance is very difficult because there are lots of very small alleyways which don't allow surveillance through imaging, certainly. So the notion of citizenship is very different there as well. Which is not to say everything is a fantastic utopia of free thought and no issues of privacy. There is camera surveillance. It has been introduced by the Tokyo metropolitan government, but usually what's targeted, and this is where it joins perhaps issues in Europe and elsewhere, is the other within inside Japan. So it's migrants, it's people who are not Japanese who are subject to forms of surveillance, whereas within Japan itself people are more subject to supervisory forms of surveillance in which they are tempted through various techniques to take part in self-formation and social development. Don't have a watch with me. I thought I could do a time there, but that's it. It says that. Okay. Well, I'm not going through what I wanted to get through at the end there. I think some of the questions then I would ask based on my limited experience so far in Japan, but I think just enough to have an insight that perhaps how we think about privacy here can be questioned from the outside, is that we can't divorce privacy from a questioning of the whole Western modernity, I think, and the notion of the individual who is central to it. And in particular, this notion of privacy as it's manifest in neoliberal globalization, which brings back the question of capitalism, notions of ownership as individual, and of exchange within free markets as unproblematic. it's not about learning from Japan and simply saying it's different. It's about actually taking a step over and trying to understand how they do things and to see if we can do things differently here. It's also, I know one of the sessions this afternoon is about thinking about privacy in a global context, and there's a trend to try and set up global norms about privacy. I suppose I would just issue a caution there, because certainly we can apply concepts like privacy, civil society, as I have done today, to Japan, but it reflects more a lack of vocabulary in the translation between the cultures than actually a reality of civil society there corresponding to what we think it is here. So in terms of global issues of privacy, regulation, and so on, I would issue a note of caution there, and perhaps try and learn from other cultures, China included as well. So I'll finish off there. I know I've possibly not raised the questions I would have liked to, but just to emphasize that the issue is really just questioning notions of Western subjectivity, the individual as the core of the privacy debate, trying to think of it in a different fashion as perhaps people do in Japan, and to see where we can go from there. So thank you very much.